November 14th, 2012. A sealed envelope is slipped under the door of a senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. Inside, a single page. A preliminary DNA result from mummy KV55, the mysterious male body found in Egypt's Valley of the Kings in 1907. What that page contained was so unexpected, so disruptive to the established historical record, that the lead geneticist on the project reportedly refused to sign off on the findings for 3 months. 3 months. While the world continued to assume it knew who built one of the greatest civilizations in human history. But here's the thing, that wasn't even the most controversial result, not by a long shot. Because once you see what DNA testing has quietly revealed about Egypt's most powerful mummies, the pharaohs, the priests, the royal bloodlines, you will understand why certain governments, certain academic institutions, and certain very powerful organizations have spent decades making sure this information stays buried, not in a tomb, in footnotes, in restricted journal access, in press releases nobody reads. Stay with me. Because what you're about to hear is not a theory, it's documented, it's sourced, and it changes everything you thought you knew. To understand why these DNA results were so dangerous, you first need to understand what was at stake. For most of the 20th century, Egyptology operated on a simple, comfortable assumption. The pharaohs were Egyptian. Fully, purely, exclusively Egyptian. Their bloodline stretched back to the Nile Delta, unbroken, unsullied by outside contact. That was the story. That was the textbook. That was what millions of students were taught in schools, from Cairo to Chicago. Then, in 2010, a team led by Dr. Zahi Hawass published what became one of the most downloaded studies in the history of the Journal of the American Medical Association. The paper, titled Ancestry and Pathology in King Tutankhamun's Family, presented the first systematic DNA analysis of 11 royal mummies from the 18th dynasty, including Tutankhamun himself, his probable father Akhenaten, and KV55, that mysterious unidentified male. The process alone was extraordinary. The team used 2 independent ancient DNA laboratories to cross-verify results, one in Cairo, one in Germany. They extracted genetic material from bone and teeth, working in sealed clean rooms to prevent contamination. They ran STR analysis, the same profiling method used in criminal forensics. And what they found confirmed certain things, but also opened doors that nobody officially wanted opened. Here is what was confirmed. Tutankhamun's paternity was established. KV55, long debated as either Akhenaten or his co-regent Smenkhkare, was almost certainly Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's father. The family tree of ancient Egypt's most powerful dynasty was finally beginning to crystallize. But then came the haplogroup results, and that's where things got very, very quiet. A haplogroup is essentially a genetic signature, a branch on the human family tree that tells you where a population's ancestors originated thousands of years ago. Tutankhamun's Y chromosome haplogroup was identified as R1b1a2. Pay attention to that. R1b1a2. Because today, that haplogroup is found in roughly 50 to 70% of Western European males, in Britain, in France, in Spain, in Germany. In modern Egypt, it appears in fewer than 1% of the male population. Let that sit for a moment. The boy king of ancient Egypt, the most iconic pharaoh in history, carried a genetic signature that, in the modern world, belongs overwhelmingly to Western Europe. The 2010 paper mentioned this result exactly once, in a single sentence, with no follow-up analysis, and then moved on. Now, before you think this is just one unusual finding about one unusual pharaoh, I need to tell you about what happened in 2021, because that's when the story stopped being about a single king and started being about an entire civilization. In January 2021, the journal Nature Communications published a landmark study, the most comprehensive ancient DNA analysis of Egyptian mummies ever conducted. The research team, led by scientists from the Max Planck Institute and the University of Tübingen, analyzed 93 mummies spanning 1,300 years of Egyptian history, from 1388 BCE to 426 CE. These were not royal mummies. These were ordinary Egyptians, priests, craftsmen, scribes, buried in the ancient city of Abu Sir el-Melek, south of Cairo. Their conclusion, published in full in a peer-reviewed journal that you can access right now if you want, was this: ancient Egyptians were most closely related, genetically, to ancient peoples of the Levant, Anatolia, and the Eastern Mediterranean, not to sub-Saharan Africa, not to modern Egyptians, to populations from what is today Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. Furthermore, the study found that modern Egyptians carried between 8 and 20% more sub-Saharan African ancestry than their ancient predecessors did, meaning the genetic composition of Egypt's population shifted significantly after the ancient civilization ended. The people who built the pyramids, who wrote the Book of the Dead, who mummified their royalty, were, genetically, a different population from the people living in Egypt today. This was not hidden, it was published openly. But watch what happened next. The mainstream science press covered it for approximately 72 hours. Then it disappeared from popular coverage. No follow-up investigations, no primetime documentaries, nothing. Now, go back to the royal mummies, because the 2021 study deliberately excluded them. The authors noted in their own methodology section that royal mummies had been outside the scope of the study due to existing access restrictions. Access restrictions on DNA samples that could rewrite the history of one of the world's great civilizations. Who controls that access? The Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities. And between 2003 and 2008, that council, under Dr. Zahi Hawass, placed an effective moratorium on international DNA testing of royal mummies. Foreign researchers were denied permits. Samples that had already been extracted in the 1990s were locked away in restricted storage in Cairo, but some results had already escaped. In 1994, a German researcher named Dr. Svante Pääbo, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 2022, attempted to extract DNA from Egyptian mummies at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. He was given limited access. What he found in that preliminary work, published quietly in a 1994 issue of Science, was that ancient Egyptian mummy tissue contained DNA sequences consistent with populations from the ancient Near East. The study was small, cautiously worded, and almost immediately challenged on contamination grounds. It was effectively buried in the academic literature. Pääbo himself moved on. He spent the next 3 decades pioneering ancient DNA research on Neanderthals. He never returned to Egyptian mummies. When asked about this in a 2019 interview, he said only that the political environment around Egyptian heritage is complicated. That's a Nobel laureate using the word complicated to describe why he avoided the most famous mummies on Earth. And I'll get to what happened in 2017, because that's the part that should have made international headlines and somehow didn't. But first, I need to show you something even more disorienting. Because up to this point, we've been talking about one pharaoh, one result, one anomaly you could theoretically explain away. What comes next, you cannot explain away. And then there is the case of Ramesses III. In 2012, a separate team published results in the British Medical Journal after analyzing DNA from Ramesses III and an unidentified male mummy found in the same tomb, labeled simply HES. The DNA confirmed that HES was Ramesses III's son. It also confirmed the cause of death. The pharaoh's throat had been slit in what historians now call the Harem Conspiracy of 1155 BCE, a plot orchestrated by one of his lesser wives to place her own son on the throne. But embedded in the same study, almost as a footnote, was another result. The Y chromosome haplogroup of Ramesses III, one of Egypt's most celebrated warrior pharaohs, the man who defeated the Sea Peoples and saved Egyptian civilization, was identified as E1b1a, a haplogroup found today primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, completely different from Tutankhamun's R1b1a2, completely different from the Levantine profiles found in the common people of Abu Sir el-Melek. 2 pharaohs, 2 completely different genetic origins, neither of them matching the other or matching the populations that supposedly surrounded them. What kind of royal dynasty produces rulers with origins that scattered across 3 different continents? Here is the question nobody is asking loudly enough. If these results are this scattered, this contradictory, this geographically impossible under the traditional model, then what was the Egyptian royal bloodline actually doing? And why is the institution best positioned to answer that question actively preventing the research? Let's be precise here, because this is where some people go off the rails into territory that serves nobody. This is not about a secret cabal. This is not about aliens. This is about something far more human and therefore far more believable. National identity, academic reputation, and political survival. Egypt's ancient history is not merely history to the Egyptian state. It is the foundation of modern Egyptian national identity. The pyramids generate roughly $2 billion in tourism revenue annually. The narrative of an unbroken, purely indigenous Egyptian civilization, from the pre-dynastic period to the pharaohs to the present day, is not just a historical claim, it is a political one. It is woven into school curricula, national holidays, passport covers, and presidential speeches. When DNA results suggest that the pharaohs may have carried bloodlines from Western Europe, or the Levant, or Sub-Saharan Africa, or all 3 simultaneously, that is not an academic curiosity. That is a political earthquake. And governments do not welcome political earthquakes, particularly when the fault line runs directly beneath their most profitable cultural asset. The academic dimension is equally important. Egyptology as a discipline has been building its consensus for over 150 years. Thousands of careers, hundreds of institutions, billions of dollars in museum endowments, all resting on a framework that ancient DNA is now beginning to challenge at the foundation. When you have spent your entire professional life arguing that the evidence points in one direction, and a geneticist with a swab and a centrifuge tells you it points somewhere else, the instinct is not gratitude. The instinct is defense. In 2008, Nature reported that Egyptian authorities had rejected a formal application by researchers from the University of Manchester to conduct DNA testing on royal mummies in the Cairo Museum. The stated reason? Concerns about the handling of heritage materials. The unstated reason, suggested by multiple researchers in background conversations documented in the same article, concern about what the results might show. In 2017, an independent Swiss genetics firm called iGenea launched a project offering to compare the haplogroup of Tutankhamun, based on the partially released 2010 data, with living individuals. Within weeks, they reported they had identified over 70% of Western European men as potential haplogroup matches for the ancient pharaoh. The story went briefly viral. Hawass publicly condemned the study. The firm's methodology was criticized, and the broader question, why does the most famous Egyptian pharaoh genetically resemble a Frenchman more than a modern Egyptian, was never formally addressed. Never addressed, not debunked, not refuted with competing data, simply not addressed. And that silence is itself a kind of answer. Because in science, when a result is wrong, you publish the counter-evidence. You replicate the study. You show your work. You don't issue press releases condemning the question, you answer it. The fact that the Egyptian royal mummies, the most studied, most famous human remains on the planet, still do not have a complete, publicly available, independently verified ancient DNA profile in 2024 is not an accident. It is a decision, made by specific people, for specific reasons, that have nothing to do with science. Here is what we actually know. The 2010 study established that Tutankhamun carried Y chromosome markers overwhelmingly common in Western Europe. The 2021 Nature Communications study showed that ancient Egyptians were genetically closest to Levantine and Anatolian populations, not to modern Egyptians. The 2012 British Medical Journal study revealed that Ramesses III carried markers associated with sub-Saharan Africa. 3 major peer-reviewed studies, 3 incompatible pictures of who Egypt's rulers actually were, and 0 institutional appetite to reconcile them. What does it mean? It might mean the royal bloodline was deliberately diversified through strategic marriage, that Egypt's rulers came from everywhere, because Egypt's power reached everywhere. It might mean the records we have been reading for a century are not just incomplete, they are curated, chosen. edited by ancient priests, medieval scribes, and modern governments, each with their own reasons to shape the story. Or it might mean something simpler and stranger than any of those explanations. Something that every new DNA result points toward, quietly in its footnotes and its supplementary data, and its carefully worded methodology sections. It might mean that the civilization we have been studying for 150 years, the one we thought we understood, is not the civilization that actually existed. If the DNA of Egypt's most powerful rulers was hidden in plain sight for decades, quietly published, carefully filed, never followed up, then what else are we not being told? And who decided we didn't need to know?